Look at him, a CEO dressed like a busboy. The comment, sharp and clear, cut through the hall, and the room rippled with muffled laughter. Hundreds of eyes turned in unison toward the entrance. A man in his 40s had just walked in, wearing a faded dark suit and scuffed heel shoes. Without an introduction, the assumption was immediate. He didn't belong here. This was Robert Hayes, a man who had once stood at the center of it all, once hailed as one of the industry's most irreplaceable minds. But this morning, in this glittering hall, he was just an outsider. A group of young men in crisp, new suits covered their mouths to hide their smirks. One of them said, deliberately loud, "The organizers are getting sloppy. Anyone can get in these days. It's ridiculous." The quiet laughter spread, cold and sharp. No one came to greet him, not a single handshake, just eyes that would glance over, linger on his old shoes and faded suit, and then turn away as if he were a scratch on a perfect painting. Robert approached the reception desk. The receptionist looked up, hesitating for a moment. "Sir, do you have an invitation? This conference is for CEOs and senior executives." Her tone wasn't a question but a statement. You couldn't possibly have one. Robert silently pulled a white invitation card from his inner pocket. The receptionist was briefly flustered, but managed a strained smile. Instead of directing him to the main entrance, she pointed to a side door. That small gesture was a message in itself. You may be here, but you do not belong. Robert walked into the hall, where the bright yellow lights washed over the rows of seats. As he passed, the lively chatter would pause, drop to a lower register, and then morph into whispers. A few quick glances, a few faint smiles, it all combined to form an invisible wall, pushing him to the margins. A young man in the front row turned, looked him up and down, and then smirked. What's wrong with the organizers? Are they letting the waitstaff sit in on the CEO summit now? A chorus of quiet laughter followed. Robert didn't respond. He chose a seat at the back of the room and silently opened a small notebook, jotting down a few lines. No one noticed, except for a young waiter who paused for a moment, looking at the man's calm face amidst a sea of contemptuous stares. But he, too, quickly moved on. To the majority, Robert Hayes was just an irrelevant figure. On stage, the MC's voice boomed. Welcome to the talented young faces, the brilliant CEOs who will be sharing their vision today. A thunderous applause. Robert remained still, as if he were an empty, invisible chair. As the young faces were called to the stage, a few of them glanced down and saw him. A shake of the head, a curl of the lip. He's in the wrong place. This isn't for him. The hall was filled with applause, flashing lights, and handshakes. But in Robert's eyes, it was all just a play, where people were measured by their suits and their appearance. He said nothing, just sat there, his eyes glowing with something no one had yet noticed. A calm so cold it was unreadable. You're listening to this, and perhaps a question has formed in your mind. Who is this man, and why is he being treated with such contempt? If you have ever been ignored, ever been treated as if you don't exist in a crowd, you will surely understand Robert's feeling. And if this experience has ever touched you, perhaps you'll want to share it. Please leave a comment under this video. Maybe someone will find themselves in your story. A group had just left the stage and was walking past the back row. A young man laughed and said, loud enough for those around him to hear, "He's probably just here for the free lunch." Another added, "That's right. Just let him sit there. At least he can be a good backdrop for us." The laughter was sharp, like a knife to the face. Robert closed his notebook. He didn't look at them, didn't defend himself. His silence only made them more certain they were right. No one knew that in just a few minutes, that very silence would make them regret it. If you've ever witnessed someone being pushed to the side, you probably feel a tightness in your chest seeing Robert sitting there. And sometimes, it's stories like this that remind us to reconsider how we treat others. If you find this meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that the next stories will find you, instead of passing by as if they never existed. The opening music ended. The hall fell into a solemn silence. The MC invited a representative from the organizing committee to the stage to speak. Amidst the thunderous applause, not a single eye turned to the corner of the room where Robert Hayes sat. He was present, but he had been neutralized. The entire room seemed to have unanimously erased him from their glamorous picture. And in that moment, amidst the bright lights, the roaring applause, and the countless contemptuous stares, the injustice was laid bare. The man who had once been the center of attention was now being demoted to an outsider. But this was only the beginning. Before he was mocked in the hall this morning, Robert Hayes was a name the entire city knew. 3 years ago, he had stood on a different stage, also brightly lit. But then, all the applause was for him. That day, he wore a simple suit and stood next to a projection screen, introducing his company's first product. His voice carried through the room without a microphone. The press called him the man who dared to challenge the giants. Investors lined up to shake his hand. His employees applauded until their hands were raw. He was hailed as a symbol of a new generation. A self-made CEO who had started with nothing. Few knew that to get to that launch day, Robert had gone through years of near exhaustion. He had lived in a small apartment with peeling walls, his desk just an old dining table. On long nights, he and his 3 co-founders would sit around a pile of documents, drinking cheap coffee from a second-hand machine. While his friends were driving new cars, he was still in his old sedan with torn seats, saving every penny for the company. Robert was always the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave. There were late nights when the whole city was asleep, but he was still there, alone, reviewing plans, crossing out lines. Before signing any contract, he would keep a separate set of notes, so meticulous that many thought it was excessive. He believed, "No one is allowed to take away my hard work, not even fate." The day his company landed its first $1 million contract, Robert broke down and cried in his car. They weren't the tears of a weak man, but the tears of someone who had seen his entire arduous youth finally pay off. In those days, his colleagues called him the man who never gives up. Success followed success. Robert's name appeared in magazines and business journals. In every photo, he wasn't the most stylishly dressed, but the determined glint in his eyes was enough to command the attention of a room. But this city never stopped spinning. As new, younger faces appeared, as flashy new companies emerged, the media spotlight quickly moved on. From being a symbol, Robert was gradually pushed to the side. The young employees who had once admired him now whispered, "He's outdated. His way of working is too rigid. We need a younger, more dynamic CEO now." No one said it to his face, but Robert felt it in every glance. In meetings, he would present an idea and receive only a polite, dismissive nod. At parties, he would sit silently at the back table, while everyone else crowded around the younger, more vibrant faces. The company, the one he had poured his entire youth into building, was slowly slipping from his grasp. The board of directors whispered about the need for a new image. Old employees avoided his gaze. The commemorative photos that had once lined the office walls were taken down and replaced with glossy new advertisements. One night, Robert returned to his rented house in the suburbs and sat in the dark living room. The streetlights cast weary shadows across his face. He flipped through his old notebook, where his handwriting from the early days of his startup was still preserved. For so many years, with his calloused hands, he had built a multi-million-dollar company. But now, in that very company, he was being treated as redundant. Once, in a meeting, Robert had warned about a strategic mistake. In response, a young director had smirked. "With all due respect, your time is over. Let the younger generation handle it." The room had roared with laughter. Not because the comment was funny, but because they thought it was true. Robert remained silent. He didn't need to scream to prove he was right. He was used to people only believing when the consequences hit. But the price of his silence was that, little by little, he was being pushed to the margins in the very place where he had once been indispensable. Do you feel this? The feeling of being disrespected in the very house you built? If you've had that experience, you will understand the emptiness Robert carried better than anyone. And maybe you have your own story. Don't hesitate to share it under this video, because maybe someone needs to read it to feel they are not alone. Robert didn't blame anyone. He knew this society chased after the shiny and new. People loved to praise the newcomers, to applaud the rising stars. As for someone who had once been at the top, if they could no longer maintain their halo, they were quickly forgotten. It was a cold truth he had witnessed too many times. But there was one thing those who looked down on him didn't know. Robert had never let go. He still kept his own plans, his own important notes. He was still quietly preparing. Not for revenge, but for the day when an opportunity would arise, and he would show the world. A person can be forgotten, but true value is never lost. And today, as he walked into that hall, being mocked, being treated as an outsider, all those years were waiting to be proven. The music in the hall stopped. The lights focused on the stage. The MC introduced a young speaker who had just founded a tech company and was being called the CEO of the new generation. A thunderous applause followed, and many people stood up to cheer. At the back of the room, Robert Hayes remained seated. He clapped, but just enough for him to hear. No one paid him any attention. The young speaker took the stage, his voice full of confidence. We are entering a new era, where only innovation and speed will determine who wins. The old models are obsolete. It's time to make way for the younger generation. Some people nodded, then turned to look at Robert as if the words were aimed directly at him. A young man didn't even bother to lower his voice. Did you hear that? His time is over. Robert looked up, his gaze meeting the stage lights. For a moment, a few people felt a strange sense of confusion. There was something in his eyes that didn't look like a defeated man. It was a calm, so cold a look that only someone who has been through both the peak and the abyss could have. A short time later, the organizers invited a veteran business representative to share a few words. The MC's eyes scanned the room, then passed over Robert as if he wasn't there. Instead, they called on another director, younger, more glamorous. Robert was ignored again, as if he had never existed. He closed his notebook and stood up. Some people were surprised, thinking he was about to leave. But Robert didn't walk toward the door. He walked straight to the coffee station. He poured himself a cup, as calm as if nothing had happened. The small act made a few people look at him with annoyance. Does he have no shame? Being disrespected like that? And he's still here. Robert turned and met their gaze, and a small smile touched his lips. A brief smile, but it was enough to make the other person flustered. No one understood why a man who had been so humiliated could smile. Just then, a middle-aged man, the director of a small to medium-sized company, approached him. He said in a low voice, "I know you, Robert Hayes. I've read articles about you. It's a shame how it all ended." Robert replied, his voice even. "Nothing has ended. It's just not time yet." The answer made the other man pause. But before he could ask more, Robert had returned to his seat. On stage, another speaker was presenting data, charts, and flowery language. People applauded on cue, cheering as if it were the gospel. But Robert remained silent, writing a few lines in his notebook. He didn't argue, didn't object. His very silence only fueled the curiosity. What on earth is he thinking? A female journalist, sitting near the back, began to pay attention to him. Not because of his old suit, but because of his unusual demeanor. When the whole hall was buzzing, he remained calm. When he was mocked, he smiled. She leaned over and asked quietly, "Who are you? I've never seen your name on the guest list." Robert replied simply, "I used to stand here, but no one remembers anymore." The words were like a cold blade. The journalist looked at him longer, her professional curiosity piqued. In the front row, one of the young speakers suddenly ran into a technical problem with his presentation. The projector died, and the file wouldn't open. The room grew noisy, and a few laughs broke out. The young man was flustered, his face red. The organizers scrambled. In that moment, Robert set down his notebook and stood up. He walked slowly toward the stage. The entire hall was stunned. Some people whispered, "What is he doing? Is he going to cause more trouble?" Robert didn't touch the projector, didn't touch any of the equipment. He just gently took the microphone, his voice calm and deep. Technology can fail, but a true leader should never stop speaking. If you believe in your idea, speak from the heart. You don't need a screen. The entire hall fell silent. The people who had been mocking him suddenly stopped. The young speaker stared at him, stunned, then swallowed hard and began to continue with his own words. Slowly, clumsily at first, but then with more confidence. And strangely, the audience was still listening. Robert handed the microphone back and returned to his seat. He didn't wait for applause, didn't wait for a thank you, but that moment was enough to plant a big question in the minds of hundreds of people. Who is this man really? After the moment Robert Hayes took the microphone, an unexplainable silence fell over the hall. No one clapped and no one objected. There were only curious eyes following him. In the press row, the young journalist quickly jotted in her notebook, "Man in the old suit, Robert Hayes?" She vaguely remembered reading that name somewhere, years ago, in an article about a booming startup. But the details were fuzzy, like a forgotten memory. During the coffee break, a few people started whispering, "He looks familiar. I think he was in Forbes once." No way. If he was in Forbes, why would he end up like this? An elderly businessman, his silver hair neatly combed, approached Robert. He held out his hand. "Robert Hayes. It's been a long time." A few people standing nearby spun around. "You know him?" they asked. The businessman gave a faint smile. "Not just know him. 10 years ago, if it weren't for Robert's company, many of the corporations in this city wouldn't exist." The words silenced the whispers. Some people started to look at Robert differently, but he just shook the man's hand gently, his voice calm. "Let's not talk about the past. I'm just here to listen." The journalist couldn't hold back and approached him. "Excuse me, are you really Robert Hayes, the founder of the Hayes Group?" Robert looked at her, his eyes bright but composed. "I was." The short answer was like a small bomb exploding among the people standing around, because the Hayes Group, though no longer in its golden age, was still a name that had once been all over the American business pages, considered one of the biggest breakthroughs of the last decade. A young man pushed through. "I can't believe it, and He flushed, remembering his earlier mocking comment. Robert didn't respond. He just picked up his coffee and took a sip, as if the other man's embarrassment had nothing to do with him. In a corner of the room, a few people were quickly searching on their phones. Images appeared. Robert Hayes standing next to his company's sign, cutting a ribbon at a grand opening, signing a contract with a major corporation. The smile from years ago was a world away from the quiet man today. Someone exclaimed, "It really is him. My God, how did no one recognize him?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because the truth was harsh. It wasn't that they didn't recognize him, but that they had never cared. This society always looks toward the new, the flashy. People who were once celebrated, if they no longer have the media spotlight, are quickly pushed into oblivion. The journalist continued, "You were once called the man who never gives up. Why are you here, alone, in this old suit?" Robert smiled, his answer slow. "Because I wanted to see how many people in this room still appreciate true value, instead of just looking at a new suit or a fancy car. The journalist was speechless. The people around them were silent, too. His words weren't an accusation. They were a mirror held up to their faces. A young businessman, who had been mocking him earlier, bowed his head and said in a low voice, I apologize, sir. I was incredibly foolish." Robert didn't nod, nor did he shake his head. He just returned to his seat at the back, as if nothing had happened. On stage, the program continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Many eyes now glanced toward Robert, no longer with contempt, but with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The whispers had changed their tone, from mockery to doubt, from doubt to respect. Meanwhile, Robert opened his old notebook and wrote a few more lines. No one knew what he was writing, but his calm expression made people feel uneasy, because now, everyone in the room was beginning to understand a truth. The man they had just mocked might be the very person who had created the stage they were standing on today. In the afternoon, the hall moved into an open discussion. The young speaker was still passionately talking about the era of speed and the replacement of the old generation. Many people nodded along, applauding as if it were the gospel. Then, the MC invited questions from the audience. A few people stood up and asked the usual questions about venture capital and marketing strategies. The atmosphere was lively, with laughter sprinkled in. And then, from the back row, Robert's deep, calm voice rose. "You say the older generation is obsolete. Do you know that it was the obsolete ones who laid the foundation for the so-called new era you're standing on today?" The entire room fell silent. All eyes were on him. The young speaker gave a small, forced laugh, trying to maintain his confident demeanor. "Sir, if I'm not mistaken, you are Robert Hayes? I've read something about your old company. But with all due respect, times have changed. Past success doesn't guarantee a place in the present." Robert stood up and walked toward a microphone. Not quickly, not slowly. The stillness in his steps only added to the heavy atmosphere. He took the microphone, his eyes fixed on the young man. "You're right. Past success doesn't guarantee the present. But at least I never beat my chest and called myself the CEO of the new generation, while forgetting that honesty and integrity are more important than any technology." A buzz went through the room. The young man was flustered but still managed a strained smile. "We're talking about innovation. No one is denying integrity. But what's important is speed. If you're slow, you get left behind." Robert leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Slow and steady is better than fast and failed. You can mock this old suit, but remember, in this very suit, I signed deals that you probably haven't even dreamed of in your entire life." A round of applause came from a corner of the room. At first, it was sparse. Then it grew stronger. It was the people who had been silently observing, who could no longer hold back. The young speaker went pale. The MC quickly tried to intervene, to change the subject, but an elderly businessman suddenly stood up. "Let Mr. Hayes speak. It's been a long time since we've heard someone mention the words integrity in this room." The entire hall was silent. Robert lowered the microphone, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. He didn't need many words. His calm, direct presence was enough to force everyone to face the truth. They had become so accustomed to celebrating the flashy that they had forgotten the core values. In the press row, the young journalist added another line to her notes. "The confrontation, a room holding its breath." A young director, who had been whispering mockingly earlier, was now looking down at the floor. He remembered every contemptuous word he had said, and each one felt like a needle turning back on him. Robert returned to his seat. He didn't smile in victory. His face was still composed, his eyes cold, but that very calmness was what made sure no one in the hall would dare to laugh again. The heavy atmosphere lingered. The MC awkwardly moved on to a new topic, but it was clear no one was paying attention. They were all haunted by one thing: The presence of Robert Hayes had completely changed the room. The conference moved on to the partnership signing session. On stage, young companies presented their projects, their growth numbers, their rosy promises. Applause and chatter followed. Robert sat still, quietly taking notes. No one paid attention to him. Or rather, no one wanted to, until an important contract was announced. A startup was presenting a partnership plan with a major corporation. The slide appeared on the screen. The terms, the strategy, the plan. Robert looked up. For a moment, he recognized the familiar words, not because the idea was new, but because it was the very plan he had written himself years ago, a plan that his board at the time had dismissed as unrealistic. He stood up, his voice even, echoing through the microphone. "Excuse me, the plan you are presenting belongs to me." The entire hall exploded. The MC was frantic. "Sir, this must be a misunderstanding?" Robert walked to the front, took out his worn-edged notebook from his pocket, and opened it. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting clear. Dates, numbers, models, everything matched, down to the last detail. "This is the original. I wrote it on in my old office. Back then, they said it was a fantasy. Today, it's being presented as a breakthrough strategy. Do you see the irony?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The young man on stage went pale, not daring to look up. The hall turned to whispers. A few directors muttered, "I can't believe it. They took Mr. Hayes's old idea?" Robert didn't scream. He just gently placed the notebook on the table, his voice slow. "You can forget my name, but the truth will never forget who created it." The young journalist immediately held up her recorder. Her eyes were bright. This was the biggest story of the entire conference. In that moment, an elderly director stood up and clapped. The first clap was met with stunned silence, then another, then many more. The entire hall, which had been silent, was now applauding. But it wasn't a polite applause. It was an acknowledgement, a collective apology to the man they had scorned. The young speaker, who had been mocking Robert earlier, said with a trembling voice, "Mr. Hayes, I didn't know." Robert cut him off, his voice cold. "You're right. You didn't know, because you never cared to look at those who came before you." The words were like a blade, slicing through the air. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to breathe. Robert walked off the stage. He didn't bow for a thank you, didn't smile in victory. He just silently walked back to the back row. In that moment, the entire hall realized. The man they had mocked for his old suit was, in fact, the foundation of the very industry they were so proud of. And that truth, once revealed, didn't need any embellishment. It stood on its own, as obvious as the sky above them. The young journalist turned to her colleague and whispered, "This story is going to make the entire city remember the name Robert Hayes." After the shock of the old notebook, the entire hall was still buzzing. But when Robert Hayes returned to the stage at the organizer's invitation, all sound stopped. People no longer looked at him with contempt, but with a mixture of respect and shame. Robert stood at the center, his voice calm, not needing to be raised. "You all asked me why I came here. I will answer. I didn't come to reclaim the spotlight. I didn't come for the applause. I came because I wanted to see for myself, in a room full of people who call themselves leaders, how many of you still understand the true value of the words human being?" The air was thick. A few people lowered their heads. He continued, "I was once celebrated, and then I was forgotten. In both of those times, I learned one thing. The spotlight says nothing about a person. What remains is how you treat others when no one is watching." A young director in the audience swallowed hard. remembering the mocking comments he had made that morning. Robert's eyes swept across the room, his gaze firm. You can get rich with a new idea. You can become famous with a news article. But if you lose your integrity, it will all collapse faster than you think. I have seen it. I have been through it. And I have paid the price. He paused, his voice dropping. Perhaps many of you will leave this hall today and continue with your busy lives. But I believe there will be a moment when you are faced with a choice, money or honesty, fame or integrity, that today's story will come back to you. And the question will be, what will you choose? The entire hall was silent. A moment later, applause broke out. At first, it was scattered. Then it grew stronger, until the entire hall was on its feet. But Robert just gave a slight bow. He didn't wave, didn't show any sign of victory. As the lights dimmed, Robert quietly left the stage. No fancy car was waiting. No crowd surrounded him. Just his slow, steady steps out the door. But in the minds of everyone there, the name Robert Hayes had returned not as a memory of the past, but as a living, breathing reminder. The young journalist rushed out after him, but by the time she opened the door, he had disappeared into the crowd. She only caught a glimpse of his silent figure, blending into the people on the street. The next morning's newspapers were filled with the story. The man mocked for his old suit turns out to be the CEO who changed an entire industry. But to Robert Hayes, it was all just noise. He returned to his small house in the suburbs, opened his old notebook, and wrote one final line. Integrity, that is the true legacy.